please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Martin, we are live right now, it seems.
Hello, Anant. How are you?
I'm very good, and sorry for the screw-up earlier today.
Well, we had a timing problem. Your timing was brilliant until we got to 10 o'clock this morning.
Anyway, to start things off, Martin, I thought, it would be a lovely recap if you told everybody how you got the name Sorrell.
How did I get it? Well, I didn't get it. It was my father got it in 1924, I think it was. He read a book by Warwick Deeping called Sorrell and Son. In fact, the BBC turned it into a series, it's like an upstairs, downstairs story. It's about a story of a butler or a manservant who devotes his life to his son. It's quite a touching story, and all his resources go to educating his son in a private school and his education and development. My father loved the story so much that he changed the name. There was a fair bit of anti-Semitism at that time, and he had a rather Russian name and thought a name change would be appropriate. So that's where Sorrell comes from.
And now, as you find a name for your company, do you search for a new bookstore?
No, I didn't search for a new bookstore, Anna. That's rather cheeky of you. What I did was just name it. I guess there are 4 generations of Sorrells that have been in the UK. So my grandfather came from Eastern Europe, together with my grandmother from the Ukraine in 1899, not speaking a word of English, so their marriage certificate had their names with crosses, and the 4 witnesses had crosses. And then my father was brought up in the East End of London, had to leave school at 13 despite a music scholarship from the Royal School of Music, and despite being able to quote Shakespeare and the Talmud frequently and at length, but he never had the opportunity. He had to become an income-producing unit. He lavished all his effort and attention, as did my mother, on me, so I was a spoilt only child. I did have a brother who died at birth, so I was the last chance, basically. And then there's my generation, and then there's my kids' generation. I have 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. And so S4 is sort of 4 generations of Sorrells in the UK, at least so far.
Right, so now to the meat. So what is S4 going to be?
I thought that was the meat, Anant. So as far as S4 is concerned, I mean, having had a chance to reflect, albeit a brief chance to reflect, and because I had time to reflect also when I was trying to run WPP, obviously our industry, the advertising and marketing services industry, is in a state of flux. I think that's the best way to put it. There's discussion as to whether that flux is strategic or structural, or whether it's cyclical, and clearly it's a mixture of both. It's an industry which, according to my calculations, or the calculations that we've been developing over 33 years at WPP, it was a $1 trillion industry, about $500 billion in traditional media and traditional communication services, and about 500 billion in the new stuff. Interestingly, Ken Auletta, in his new book, Frenemies, which will be out on the street shortly, talks about it being a $2 trillion industry, so I'm grateful to him for doubling it up in size. I'm not sure that that statistic is particularly accurate, but I think the 1 trillion is more like it. But clearly there's significant change, whether that's because of Google and Facebook, whether that's because of Accenture and IBM and Deloitte, or whether it's because of significant change in the way that clients are going about their business, there is structural and there is cyclical change. There is significant flux in the industry. And I think that brings opportunities. So if you look at that $1 trillion, or if you look at that $20 billion that was and is inside WPP, there are parts of it that are growing, and there are parts of it that are either stagnant or declining. And it's a question of identifying those growth opportunities, probably in two buckets. I mean, it's, I think, quite interesting, certainly to me personally, that I'm talking to you, Anant, in India, and talking to people in India. And of course, if I look at WPP today and over the last few years, India has been a pivotal economy for WPP. It has a very large market share in that market. It has 14 or 15,000 extremely talented people who I've always thought that if we had, and said when I was in India and outside India, if we had the same quality everywhere in the world, I could have retired a long, long time ago. So it's interesting that India represents the two buckets that I'm referring to. The first bucket being the geographical one, faster growth in terms of GDP, population and potential. India, in a few years' time, will be the most populous country on the planet, and one with one of the youngest profiles on the planet. And secondly, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, from a technological point of view, India has leapfrogged a lot of the technologies, the desktop technologies and ordinary phones, almost from analog to smartphone in one leap, and represents significant opportunity. And there's been a lot of highly disruptive approaches in India. We're going through one now in distribution with Amazon and Flipkart and Walmart and Alibaba, but we have gone into it or been through it with the disruption caused in 5G, particularly by Jio and Mukesh Ambani's very significant investment in telecommunications and technology. So to me, it's interesting, maybe partly by accident, that I end up talking to you and your audience, because India represents to me opportunities in terms of growth, both economic growth and technological growth. And I think those are the two buckets. And there are then three things that obviously people are very focused on, whether they be clients, media owners, or people in our industry, or indeed share owners or investors. They are technology, data, and content. So those three elements are really key to the growth. And if I look at last year, it strikes me there were two seminal moments for the industry. The first was the abortive attempted takeover of Unilever by Kraft Heinz, which only lasted 48 hours, but was an iconic moment because basically it said no company, no particularly packaged goods company, was safe. And the second iconic moment was in November when Rupert Murdoch signaled that he would negotiate a deal in relation to Fox with Disney, although the situation has become much more complicated with the involvement of Comcast. So those two moments seem to me to be the iconic ones last year, which signaled significant disruption. Again, structural and cyclical. We can argue as to how much structural and how much cyclical, but a lot of disruption for clients and for media owners. And those were the two signals, I think, that really laid out the agenda and what will be the agenda for S4 Capital. Not easy to navigate, not easy to do. It's a big hill to climb, but S4 Capital is the first brick in the wall.
Right. Martin, while on this, what is your prognosis in the future of the network, agency network, and the network agency, both?
Well, I think the network agencies and the holding companies, certainly have a strong future. I have no doubt about that. It's a $1 trillion industry, or according to Ken, a $2 trillion industry. There's a lot of opportunity in an industry that size. But of course, as I saw at WPP, and as I see in the brief time I've been out of WPP, and as I look at what S4 Capital may or may not do, there are very significant opportunities. If you think of that $1 trillion, or indeed the $20 billion at WPP, you see parts of the business that are growing, you see parts of the business that are flat, and you see parts of the business that are declining. When you have a legacy company, any legacy company, it doesn't have to be WPP, it can be Omnicom, it can be Publicis, it can be Dentsu, it can be Havas, it can be IPG, indeed it could be MDC. They all have legacy bits to them that, of course, given the changes I've just touched on and you've touched on, mean that the business is more challenged than if you start with a clean sheet of paper. So I think starting with a clean sheet of paper is an advantage. It enables you to choose where you're going to go and to choose the areas of activity without being a prisoner of history. And if you do have legacy businesses, they have advantages. They have reputation. They have contact and networks. They have the people of great talent inside them. But maybe the historic structures impose conditions on their operation which make it more difficult. So certainly with a clean sheet of S4 Capital and using the cash shell that we announced today with Deriston gives us an opportunity to build afresh, taking into account the changes that are taking place at clients, the new structures that clients want, the new approaches they want, given the new structures and changes that are taking place in media, and then finally the changes that are taking place in industry in terms of production, whether it be robotics or 3D printing or distribution with Amazon and Alibaba and Tencent and others. So looking at all those things, I think it gives us an opportunity to plant our flag where we think, or flags where we think the greatest opportunities are.
Right. Martin, now with GDPR and stuff like that, how do you see the tech majors reacting? Do you think this is going to sort of even the playing field a little bit?
Well, I don't think GDPR, and it's early days to assess the impact, and we've seen the impact of Cambridge Analytica on Facebook, or rather, I would say the non-impact on Facebook. I mean, certainly from what I've heard and seen, Facebook's advertising revenues, at least to date, seem relatively unimpacted by what we've seen at Cambridge Analytica and all the regulatory issues that have so far been raised. And I have to say that from my perspective, Google and Facebook, Google strongly, and I think Facebook now, given what they've gone through, strongly too. I don't think that was the case maybe before Cambridge Analytica with Facebook, but both companies are making strenuous efforts. I think in the case of Google, at least 10,000 people, and in the case of Facebook, maybe as much as 20,000 or more, to monitor the content. And you and I have talked about this for many years. Those companies, in my view, are media companies, certainly as far as their operations are concerned in the areas where GDPR is operative. And as media companies, I think they're responsible, at least in whole or in part, for their content. And I think they're beginning to acknowledge that. Having said that, their scale, but Facebook and Google are amongst the top 5 most highly valued companies in the world. And you put them together with the 2 Chinese companies, you have 7 companies which are worth half, and Apple is the one at the moment that is threatening to hit the $1 trillion mark. But you take, this is immense power in those 7 companies. I liken them to the 7 sisters from a century or so ago in the energy business. And we all know the regulatory issues that the 7 sisters faced. And I think it's almost inevitable that there will be regulatory issues surrounding those companies, even the Chinese companies in some way, shape or form, although it might be quite different in terms of nature and impact. But GDPR, certainly in its early stages, to my mind, seems to favor the tech giants. If anything, we've seen the smaller and medium-sized companies withdraw from the European market rather than compete. I thought it was very interesting. I saw Commissioner Vestager on, I think it was on an ABC program in the United States. I think it was 60 Minutes. I might be wrong, where she said that she was sort of critical of Google. She has 2 more decisions to come down in Europe. I think she has 3 decisions to make. She's made anti-competitive decisions. 1 she's made and 2 are to come. And I think this is the big issue. I think with size comes and power comes responsibility. Both companies, and indeed the other tech companies like Apple, like Microsoft, like Amazon, like Tencent, like Alibaba, have such scale, they have such profitability, they have such margins that, of course, they will be continuously under pressure to provide solutions to the type of issues that are being discussed as we sit here with Mark Zuckerberg, for example, being in Europe and discussing the regulatory issues that Facebook faces, and he has publicly acknowledged that you know, there will be more regulation within the industry. But I have to say that I think GDPR in its infancy is actually probably favoring the big tech companies, and those walled gardens are becoming higher. They're not being lowered by what we've seen so far. They're being strengthened and intensified and growing taller. So I think the most interesting thing, just moving on a little bit from that, is the battle that is developing between the sort of the 3 tech giants. That would be Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Amazon is building a very powerful advertising platform. It's running at about $2 billion a quarter, so it's only at $8 billion on a run rate basis, from best as we can see. Google's at 100 last year, probably 125 billion this year, and Facebook at about 40 last year, maybe 50, 55 this year. So Amazon is very much in its infancy, but its advertising platform is a very big threat to the digital domination of Google and Facebook. And then, of course, on search, we already know the Kantar statistic that 55% of product searches in the United States already emanate from Amazon, or from Alexa and the like, from voice search or search on Amazon. So clearly Amazon is a big threat, not only on the advertising side, but on the search side, particularly with Google. So there will be a battle royal between those 3 companies in the area of search and advertising. So whatever comes with GDPR, whatever advantages the big tech companies get from that, there's certainly going to be a big battle in the tech area. And of course, we'll come on, no doubt, in your questions to what's happening with Flipkart and Amazon and Walmart and Alibaba and Tencent.
So what's happening with Flipkart and Walmart and Amazon in India?
Well, I mean, you know from your own market the intensity of the competition. Walmart making major changes across the world, here in the UK, in America, in other markets, in Latin America, in Brazil, in India, to its approach, and in China, to its approach and its structure and who it partners with. And then, of course, you have Amazon and Alibaba doing the same. The interesting thing to me is, and you would know far more about, and your audience would know far more about it than I do, but I think this does throw up this sort of battle royal in India does throw up big questions about the future of distribution. And I don't know, you would know, Anna, what the total number of people in India is that depend on distribution in one way, shape or form. That would be wholesaling or retailing or distribution generally. What proportion of the population depend on distribution for their livelihood and their living and their families? And I think the sort of changes that we're seeing have fundamental social impacts, not just impacts surrounding distribution of wealth and income, the inequality debate, but also on employment. And to my mind, the biggest issue in India as a result of the changes in distribution are not the changes in distribution per se, but what they do for politics and the voting population. I mean, it is going to become, I think, a very serious issue about the impact of these technological changes on the prospects for employment. I happen to be now and historically somebody who believes that technological development has, whilst positive, obviously from a productivity point of view, an efficiency point of view, does bring some challenges to employment. And I think the distribution industry, retail and wholesale in India, faces a big challenge as to how jobs are restored to those people who will lose their jobs as a result of these significant changes in distribution. Of course, once the Congress Party, the BJP and others, I think, wake up to the political implications, I think that we will see some interesting developments in economic policy. As you know, from the years that I've known you and many people in the audience, like Srini, who now is, I'm glad to see, is now fully engaged as country manager for WPP in India, and not before time. I mean, WPP India is a very strong force and continues to build its revenues, profitability, margins, and of course its market share. But the company has big opportunities, I think, because of these changes that are taking place in distribution and technology in India and in an economy that continues to grow. I can continue to have I continue to be a raging Indian bull, unashamed raging Indian bull, and Prime Minister Modi has made a significant impact on the Indian economy. It does seem that the momentum has slightly shifted down, and obviously that's because of the demonetization and the GST that we saw recently to some extent, and for maybe other factors too. But I think the political trends in India will continue to improve, and the economic background for the country will continue to improve. And I'm sure that WPP and indeed other companies within India will continue to improve on the back of strong economic growth and strong technological change, bearing in mind there are some political consequences, namely in terms of employment, that follow.
Right. While on the topic of employment, should media and advertising agency professionals get their CVs up to date for S4?
Well, they can get their CVs up to date for S4 Capital. I'd be delighted to receive CVs and ideas in relation to S4 Capital if I could be so bold as to make that ad. But having said that, you know, I think there are sufficient opportunities geographically and technologically, and in the areas that not just the technology area, but data and content too. There are sufficient opportunities. There is sufficient upside opportunities. If we're prepared to change and adapt our thinking, there are sufficient opportunities that they don't have to look elsewhere. I mean, I noticed this morning that the banks here in the UK, despite Brexit and despite some of the depressing news around Brexit, a number of the banks announced that graduate applications were up very significantly in the UK. And I think those applications should be up significantly in our industry too. There's no reason to despair, and there's no reason to be negative. There are very significant opportunities, but it does mean that we are going to be subject to significant change. And again, it doesn't matter whether we debate structural or cyclical. You know, one thing we haven't touched on so far is the growth of the consultancies, and I was very interested in an interview that Brian Whipple gave. He's the head of consulting at Accenture, to Brian Weeno, who I think is one of the best, the pivotal analyst. That's the name of the company, and probably a good description of me. He is a pivotal analyst in America, and he gave that interview a couple of weeks ago, and he said, the reason I alighted on it, I guess, because I've been saying it for some time, that the consulting companies don't compete head-on with the agencies. They go above the agencies. They go to the CEOs and the CFOs and the CMOs and the CIOs and the CTOs, and they say to them, you're going through significant change. They might describe it as a digital disruption. You're spending a lot of money. Let's look at it as one, and let's see how we can improve your productivity, improve your technological response, digitize your company, transform your company, and at the same time, spend less money. And by the way, pay us on the basis of what we save you, which is a very alluring concept. So they go in up here, and we're down here. So what we have to do is to sharpen our tactical response, but also develop our strategic response too at the higher levels of the company. So what S4 Capital will be, amongst other things, looking at is what they can do tactically, for sure, seeing how clients are changing their point of view, how they're looking at things globally and locally and maybe less regionally, how they're looking at local competition, what the Financial Times has called piranha brands, and what others, people in China call gladiator brands. The interesting use of language, how new companies in India, in China, in Russia, in Brazil, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Argentina, wherever, in Africa, in South Africa, how they're developing their concepts and competing and developing market share. Look at how the clients are developing.